August 6, 1943. 2333 hours. Bridge of the destroyer Hagikaze, Vella Gulf, Solomon Islands. Commander Sugiura Kaju strained into the darkness, his binoculars scanning the black waters ahead. Around him, 3 other destroyers steamed in loose column formation, their decks crowded with 950 soldiers bound for Vila on Kolombangara. For 20 months of war, Japanese destroyers had owned the night. They had perfected tactics that crushed Allied forces at Savo Island, Tassafaronga, and a dozen lesser engagements. Their superior optics, rigorous training, and devastating Type 93 long-lance torpedoes had made them masters of darkness. What Commander Sugiura didn't understand, couldn't comprehend as his force pushed north through Vella Gulf, was that 6 American destroyers waited in the shadows ahead, tracking his every move with technology that rendered Japanese visual superiority meaningless. In less than 10 minutes, those American ships would fire 24 torpedoes in 63 seconds, a rate of launch Japanese intelligence had never predicted American destroyers could achieve. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The mathematics of Japanese defeat were being calculated not in the glorious surface gun battles that doctrine anticipated, but in the cold precision of radar-directed torpedo attacks that would shatter 2 decades of tactical assumptions and psychological confidence in a single, catastrophic engagement. The pattern of Japanese supremacy in night combat had been built deliberately, methodically, over 20 years of intense preparation. After the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, where Admiral Togo's torpedo boats had savaged the Russian fleet under cover of darkness at Tsushima, the Imperial Navy enshrined night fighting as sacred doctrine. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 had left Japan at a permanent disadvantage in capital ships, bound to a 5-5-3 ratio that guaranteed American and British numerical superiority in battleships. Japanese naval planners, confronting the reality that they could never match American industrial production ton for ton, embraced a strategy of qualitative superiority in specialized tactics. Night combat and torpedo warfare became the cornerstone of a doctrine designed to whittle down a superior American fleet before the decisive daylight gun battle that Japanese planning anticipated. The training was relentless and dangerous. Destroyer crews spent months in specialized programs developing night vision capabilities. Lookouts underwent selection processes that tested their ability to spot ship silhouettes at extreme ranges in low light. Those who qualified spent hours in darkened rooms, their eyes adapting, their diet carefully controlled to avoid vitamin A deficiencies that might impair night vision. By 1941, the average Japanese lookout could identify ship types at 7,000 meters on a moonless night, double the distance achievable by American counterparts who relied on lookouts trained primarily for daylight operations. The technology Japan deployed reinforced this human advantage. Nippon Kogaku, later known as Nikon, manufactured binoculars with exceptional light-gathering capacity and magnification that surpassed anything in American service. Japanese destroyers carried powerful searchlights, positioned for optimal illumination of targets, while minimizing exposure of the launching ship. Float planes launched from cruisers could drop parachute flares that silhouetted enemy formations against the night sky, while Japanese ships remained invisible in surrounding darkness. Most critically, Japan possessed the Type 93 oxygen torpedo, the long lance. Developed through the 1920s and 1930s at enormous cost and considerable danger, this weapon represented Japanese engineering at its zenith. 29.5 feet long, 2 feet in diameter, weighing over 6,000 pounds with a warhead exceeding 1,000 pounds of high explosive, the Type 93 could reach targets at 22,000 yards, while traveling at 48 to 49 knots. Its propulsion system, burning kerosene with pure compressed oxygen instead of air, produced almost no visible wake, no telltale bubble trail that might warn targets of incoming death. For comparison, the American Mark 15 torpedo carried by destroyers achieved a maximum range of only 6,000 yards at 46 knots, with a much smaller warhead of 825 pounds. Japanese destroyer captains trained extensively in coordinated night torpedo attacks, perfecting techniques for launching massive salvos from long range against formations that would never see the weapons coming until detonations tore open hulls below the waterline. Reload crews drilled endlessly, though wartime conditions rarely permitted the time required for manual torpedo reloading during combat. The doctrine emphasized firing full broadsides, saturating target areas with enough weapons to guarantee hits regardless of evasive maneuvers. The early months of the Pacific War validated every assumption. At the Battle of Savo Island on August 9, 1942, a force of Japanese cruisers and a single destroyer surprised an Allied screening force, protecting the Guadalcanal landings. In 33 minutes of savage night combat, Japanese ships sank 4 heavy cruisers, the Australian, Canberra, and American Quincy, Vincennes, and Astoria, killing over 1,000 Allied sailors. The victory was so complete, so devastating, that it nearly forced the withdrawal of American forces from Guadalcanal entirely. Type 93 torpedoes fired from ranges Allied commanders thought impossible had struck before lookouts even spotted Japanese muzzle flashes. At the Battle of Tassafaronga on November 30, 1942, 8 Japanese destroyers conducting a supply run to Guadalcanal encountered 5 American heavy cruisers and 6 destroyers. The Americans had superior numbers, superior firepower, radar that should have provided tactical advantage. Commander Raizo Tanaka, commanding the Japanese force, ordered his destroyers to turn away when spotted, filling the water with 44 Type 93 torpedoes as they withdrew. 1 American heavy cruiser sank, 3 more suffered crippling damage that removed them from service for months, while Japanese losses totaled a single destroyer. American after-action reports struggled to explain how a force conducting evasive maneuvers had achieved such devastating results. The answer lay in Japanese torpedo doctrine that emphasized firing massive spreads from optimal angles, tactics perfected through years of realistic night training that American forces had never matched. By mid-1943, Japanese destroyer captains operated with confidence born of repeated victory. They had beaten British, Dutch, Australian, and American forces in night engagements. They had proven that superior technology and training could defeat numerically superior enemies. Intelligence reports noting American torpedo failures in early war submarine operations and surface actions reinforced beliefs that American weapons were inferior, that American crews lacked the skill and warrior spirit necessary for effective night combat. What Japanese intelligence failed to recognize, what operational commanders dismissed when fragmentary evidence suggested otherwise, was that American technology was advancing at speeds Japanese planners couldn't comprehend, and American tactical doctrine was evolving rapidly based on hard-learned lessons paid for in sunken ships and drowned sailors. The SG surface search radar, developed by the MIT Radiation Laboratory and deployed to American destroyers beginning in mid-1942, represented a quantum leap in naval warfare technology. Operating at 3 GHz with 50 kilowatts of peak power, the SG radar could detect destroyers at 15 nautical miles, with accuracy of plus or minus 40 yards in range and plus or minus 0.5 degrees in bearing. The plan position indicator display provided operators with a god's-eye view of the battle space, updating every 2 seconds, showing all contacts on a circular screen that functioned regardless of darkness, weather, smoke, or any other condition that might blind visual lookouts. Integration with the Mark 37 gun director and analog fire control computers meant American destroyers could engage targets with gunfire from beyond visual range, with accuracy impossible through optical sights alone. But more importantly for torpedo tactics, radar allowed American commanders to track enemy formations continuously, calculate firing solutions with precision, and maneuver into optimal attack positions while remaining completely undetected by Japanese lookouts, scanning desperately into darkness that revealed nothing. The Fletcher-class destroyers, 175 of which entered service between 1942 and 1944, mounted 10 21-inch torpedo tubes in 2 quintuple mounts positioned amidships. This represented the heaviest torpedo broadside of any destroyer in service at the time. The tubes could be trained independently, allowing flexibility in firing angles. Most critically, Well-drilled crews could launch all 10 torpedoes in rapid succession, emptying both mounts in less than 90 seconds under combat conditions. American destroyer doctrine evolved slowly, painfully, through defeats that cost thousands of lives. The early war emphasis on remaining with cruiser forces for anti-aircraft protection and gun support had resulted in confused night actions, where friendly ships fired on each other while Japanese forces maneuvered freely. The Battle of Kolombangara on July 13, 1943 saw American cruisers and destroyers engage Japanese forces with mixed results. 3 Japanese ships sank, but American losses included the light cruiser Helena and severe damage to other vessels. Japanese long lances fired from extreme range continued devastating American formations that expected torpedo attacks only at much closer ranges. Commander Arleigh Burke, studying these engagements aboard destroyers that barely survived, developed new tactical concepts that emphasized destroyer independence, radar utilization, and coordinated torpedo attacks launched before gun engagements revealed American positions. His recommendations filtered up through command channels to Rear Admiral Theodore Wilkinson, who commanded Task Force 31.2. When intelligence indicated another Japanese destroyer run to Kolombangara on the night of August 6, Wilkinson had no cruisers available after recent damage and losses. He assigned the mission to Commander Frederick Moosbrugger, with 6 destroyers and explicit permission to ignore standing tactical advice that emphasized long-range gunnery over torpedo attacks. Moosbrugger, commanding Destroyer Division 12 since July, had drilled his ships relentlessly in radar-directed night torpedo tactics. His force included 3 destroyers from Division 12, Dunlap, Craven, and Maury, which retained full torpedo batteries. 3 destroyers from Division 15, Lang, Sterrett, and Stack, had sacrificed 1 torpedo mount for additional 40mm anti-aircraft guns, but maintained significant torpedo capability. All 6 ships carried SG surface search radar operated by trained crews who understood its capabilities and limitations. The battle plan reflected lessons learned from earlier disasters. Moosbrugger would divide his force into 2 divisions approaching from opposite flanks. Division 12 would locate targets using radar, maneuver into optimal firing position using the darkness and bulk of Kolombangara Island for concealment, then fire coordinated torpedo salvos before Japanese lookouts detected American presence. Division 15 would provide overwatch, positioned to attack any Japanese attempt to turn into the torpedo spread, or to engage any barges that might be encountered inshore. Most critically, both divisions would maintain radio silence and avoid gunfire until torpedoes struck, denying Japanese forces any warning that might allow evasive maneuvers. The approach demonstrated how completely radar had transformed night naval warfare. At 2200 hours on August 6, Moosbrugger's 6 destroyers entered Vella Gulf from the south, radar operators scanning their screens while topside lookouts saw nothing but darkness. The destroyers first checked the southern approaches, their radar confirming no enemy presence, then turned north to sweep up the Gulf toward the expected Japanese route. Crews were at battle stations, coffee and sandwiches distributed after midnight, men waiting with the peculiar tension that comes before combat, not knowing if the enemy would appear or if the night would pass without contact. At 2333 hours, radar operators on Dunlap detected contacts at 28,000 yards, slightly over 10 nautical miles to the north. The contacts, 4 distinct returns, were moving south at steady speed on predictable courses. Japanese confidence that American forces would be at the southern end of the Gulf, far from this approach route, meant the enemy formation maintained steady course and speed, conserving fuel, showing no indication they suspected American presence. Commander Sugiura aboard Hagikaze, leading the Japanese column with destroyers Arashi and Kawakaze, following in loose formation, while Shigure, unburdened by troops, travelled with greater spacing to the rear, saw nothing alarming. His lookouts, trained to spot American ships at 7,000 meters, reported clear waters ahead. The night was dark but not completely black, weather calm, conditions optimal for the supply mission. Vila lay ahead, friendly forces waiting for the reinforcements his destroyers carried. In less than 4 hours, they would complete the delivery and withdraw south before American dawn air patrols could catch them exposed in daylight. What Sugiura couldn't see, what his lookouts couldn't detect, what Japanese technology couldn't reveal, was that 8 miles ahead American destroyers were maneuvering into attack position with precision guided by electronics that rendered Japanese visual superiority meaningless. Moosbrugger ordered course changes that brought his division into optimal firing geometry, his ships crossing from east to west to position themselves with Kolombangara's bulk as backdrop, making American silhouettes invisible against dark land mass, while Japanese destroyers stood out against open water, reflecting faint starlight. At 2341 hours, with range closed to approximately 12,000 yards, Moosbrugger ordered his division to fire torpedoes. The 3 destroyers of Division 12, Dunlap, Craven, and Maury, launched 24 Mark 15 torpedoes in 63 seconds. The weapons, set for intermediate speed and 6-foot depth, raced toward the Japanese formation at 33 knots. Unlike the dramatic cinema moments where submarine commanders watch single torpedoes track toward targets, this was industrial warfare, volume fire designed to saturate target areas and guarantee hits regardless of last-minute evasive maneuvers. The moment torpedoes cleared the tubes, all 3 American destroyers turned hard to starboard, accelerating to 30 knots, withdrawing behind smoke screens and using Kolombangara's geography to break line of sight with any Japanese attempt at visual contact or gunfire response. Division 15 maneuvered to cross ahead of the Japanese formation, positioning to deliver gunfire and additional torpedoes from a different angle if the first attack failed, or if Japanese ships turned into the torpedo spread. Commander Sugiura's first warning that anything was wrong came at 2345 hours, when lookouts finally spotted American destroyers turning away to starboard. By then, 24 torpedoes had been running toward his formation for 4 minutes, closing at combined speeds approaching 60 knots. Sugiura, at the rear of the formation and with no troops aboard to slow reaction time, managed to launch 8 Type 93 torpedoes toward the estimated American position, but all 8 missed entirely as the targets had already withdrawn behind Kolombangara's coast. The 3 troop-carrying destroyers, burdened by 900 soldiers crowding their decks, equipment stowed in spaces that restricted movement, reacted with fatal slowness. At 2346 hours, multiple American torpedoes struck all 3 ships nearly simultaneously. Hagikaze and Arashi both took hits in their engineering spaces. The 825-pound Mark 15 warheads, while smaller than the massive charges carried by Japanese long lances, were more than sufficient to tear open destroyer hulls and detonate fuel bunkers. Both ships burst into flames immediately, their machinery spaces flooding, electrical power failing, damage control parties struggling in darkness broken only by spreading fires. Hagikaze suffered the most catastrophic hit. An American torpedo detonated directly against her magazine storage, the secondary explosion breaking her keel and tearing the destroyer in half. She capsized and sank in less than 8 minutes, taking most of her crew and the soldiers she carried with her to the bottom of Vella Gulf. Only 4 men from Hagikaze's complement would survive. Division 15, now positioned ahead of the stricken Japanese formation, opened fire with 5-inch guns and remaining torpedoes. The radar-directed gunfire was devastatingly accurate, shells impacting burning Japanese destroyers that presented perfect targets silhouetted by their own fires. Moosbrugger's Division 12, having withdrawn far enough to reload if time permitted, turned back and added their gunfire to the slaughter. By midnight, Hagikaze and Arashi had stopped firing, their guns silent, their superstructures wrecked by American shells. Both destroyers would sink before dawn. Sugiura, the sole survivor, attempted to reload her torpedo tubes, Japanese crews demonstrating the training that had made them legendary. In 23 minutes, they had 8 more long lances ready, and Sugiura's captain turned back toward the engagement, determined to extract vengeance for his destroyed squadron. At 010 hours on August 7th, Sugiura's lookouts saw Arashi's magazines explode in a fireball visible for miles. The scope of the disaster became clear. 3 destroyers destroyed, 950 soldiers drowned or burning in oil-covered water, American forces unscathed and still capable of renewed attack. Sugiura's captain, facing overwhelming odds against an enemy he couldn't see, couldn't locate with any certainty, ordered withdrawal. Japanese doctrine emphasized aggressive attacks, warrior spirit, death before dishonor, but doctrine written for night combat where Japanese advantages prevailed meant nothing when technology negated every traditional superiority. American destroyers attempted to rescue Japanese survivors floating in the Gulf's warm waters. Many refused, swimming away from rescue craft or drowning themselves rather than accepting assistance from enemies they'd been taught were racially inferior and barbaric. Some few accepted rescue, pulled from the water, shocked and burned, barely comprehending the technological revolution that had destroyed their force so completely. In total, 1,210 Japanese soldiers and sailors died in Vella Gulf. Japanese losses included 3 destroyers and virtually all troops intended for Vila. American casualties totaled exactly 1 man injured in an onboard accident, a gun loader suffering a crush injury. Not a single American ship was struck by shell, torpedo, or bullet. The disparity was so complete that Admiral Chester Nimitz would later call it a little classic of naval warfare. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Captain Tamechi Hara, commanding Sugiura, the sole Japanese survivor, later wrote in his memoir that it was a perfect American victory, words coming from a man who would survive the entire war as the only Japanese destroyer captain from Pearl Harbor to see surrender. Hara had commanded Hagikaze at the Battle of Guadalcanal in November 1942, where his destroyer's torpedoes had helped sink American ships. He had experienced Japanese superiority firsthand and now witnessed its complete reversal in less than a year. The psychological impact on Japanese naval forces transcended the material losses. For 20 months, Japanese destroyers had dominated night combat. They had perfected tactics through realistic training that cost lives in peacetime accidents, but produced crews who could execute complex maneuvers in darkness with precision. They had weapons superior to anything Allies deployed. They had confidence born of repeated victory, the certainty that warrior spirit and superior training would prevail against enemies who relied on industrial production because they lacked martial virtue. Vella Gulf shattered these assumptions completely and irrevocably. American destroyers, operating independently without cruiser support, had achieved victory through technology that Japanese forces couldn't counter and tactics specifically designed to negate Japanese advantages. The radar that tracked targets beyond visual range, the coordinated torpedo attacks launched with industrial precision, the discipline that maintained radio silence and avoided premature gunfire, all demonstrated evolution in American naval doctrine that Japanese intelligence had failed to detect and operational commanders had dismissed when fragmentary evidence suggested such changes were occurring. The battle's tactical details revealed the thoroughness of the transformation. American radar had detected Japanese forces at ranges where human eyes saw only darkness. American destroyers had maneuvered into optimal attack positions, while Japanese lookouts reported clear waters. American torpedoes had been launched based on radar plots, not visual contact, with firing solutions calculated by analog computers that didn't care about darkness, weather, smoke, or any environmental factor that confused human perception. The rate of launch, 24 torpedoes in 63 seconds from 3 destroyers, represented industrial coordination that Japanese doctrine hadn't anticipated because it exceeded anything Japanese destroyers achieved, even under ideal training conditions. Japanese destroyers typically carried 9 torpedoes in 3 triple mounts and could achieve devastating effect when circumstances permitted coordinated attacks. But Japanese reload procedures, while practiced extensively, were manual operations requiring calm seas and considerable time. American quintuple mounts, while lacking reload capability under combat conditions, provided volume of fire that more than compensated. 10 torpedoes per destroyer meant Fletcher-class ships could launch spreads that saturated target areas with enough weapons to guarantee hits. The broader implications spread through Japanese naval command, like ripples from Vella Gulf's sunken destroyers. If darkness no longer provided advantage, if American technology could detect and track Japanese forces at will while remaining invisible to Japanese lookouts, then the entire tactical foundation of Japanese naval doctrine required reassessment. The Tokyo Express supply runs that sustained isolated garrisons, the destroyer sweeps that had terrorized Allied shipping, the night combat tactics that had won victories at Savo Island and Tassafaronga, all suddenly became liabilities rather than assets. Darkness that had been Japan's greatest ally was now an environment where American technological superiority negated every traditional advantage Japan possessed. Within a week of Vella Gulf, Japanese command concluded that Kolombangara could not be held. The garrison they had built up through dangerous destroyer runs, the troops they'd lost attempting resupply, represented wasted effort and resources that couldn't be sustained if every supply mission faced radar-directed torpedo attacks. Preparations began for evacuation, abandoning positions purchased with considerable blood because American technology had rendered them untenable. By early October, Japanese forces had completely withdrawn from Kolombangara, the island bypassed by American forces who simply moved west to Vela, leaving the now empty Japanese garrison isolated and irrelevant. The tactical lessons from Vella Gulf spread through American destroyer forces with the enthusiasm of vindication. For 18 months, destroyer crews had fought from disadvantage, operating under cruiser control, constrained by doctrine that emphasized defensive screens rather than offensive action, frustrated by torpedo failures that turned perfect attacks into humiliating defeats. Vella Gulf proved that American destroyers, equipped with functioning torpedoes and free to employ tactics suited to their capabilities, could achieve decisive victories against forces that had dominated night combat since war began. Commander Burke, now promoted and given larger responsibilities, incorporated Vella Gulf's lessons into planning for subsequent operations. The emphasis on radar utilization, coordinated torpedo attacks launched before gunfire revealed positions, division of forces into attack and overwatch elements, all became standard doctrine. American destroyer captains, studying Moosbrugger's battle plan, recognized that technology had fundamentally altered the balance of naval combat, shifting advantage from forces with superior human vision and training to forces with superior electronics and willingness to employ them aggressively. The statistics documented a revolution in warfare that would never be reversed. Before Vella Gulf, Japanese destroyers had consistently bested American forces in night combat. The exchange ratio in destroyer losses through July 1943 favored Japan significantly despite American numerical superiority and growing technological advantage. After Vella Gulf, the pattern reversed dramatically. Japanese destroyers would fight American forces 5 more times in the Solomons before achieving another victory, at Cape Street, George, in November, and that victory would again demonstrate radar-directed American superiority, with 3 Japanese destroyers sunk for 0 American losses. The weapons that sank those ships at Vella Gulf were Mark 15 torpedoes, the same basic design that had failed spectacularly in early war engagements, that had suffered from the same defects plaguing submarine-launched Mark 14s. The transformation in American torpedo effectiveness stemmed from solutions identified through systematic testing that Bureau of Ordnance had resisted for nearly 2 years, while blaming failures on operator incompetence. By September 1943, depth control problems had been corrected, magnetic exploders deactivated, contact exploders redesigned with lighter firing pins that functioned reliably at high impact velocities. The torpedoes that destroyed Hagikaze, Arashi, and Kawakaze worked as designed because American engineers had finally acknowledged defects and implemented fixes. Japanese intelligence, monitoring American communications and interrogating prisoners, struggled to understand what had changed. Reports noted American confidence. Torpedoes that had previously been objects of ridicule among Japanese naval officers who knew American weapons suffered catastrophic failure rates. The psychological shift among American crews, from frustrated resignation to aggressive confidence, suggested improvements that Japanese technical intelligence couldn't fully characterize. Some reports correctly identified radar as the decisive factor, but recommendations for countermeasures founded on Japan's industrial limitations and the fundamental reality that Japanese electronics industry was years behind American capability. Japan's Type 22 surface search radar, when it functioned, which was less than half the time, operated at frequencies and power levels that provided perhaps one-third the capability of American SG radar. More critically, Japanese radar lacked the sophisticated plan position indicator displays that gave American operators intuitive understanding of battlespace geometry. Japanese radar displayed range information on simple A-scope screens that showed contacts as spikes on a baseline, providing no bearing information, no ability to track multiple targets simultaneously, no intuitive interface that allowed rapid tactical decision-making. Attempts to develop countermeasures founded on resource constraints and inter-service rivalry. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy maintained separate, incompatible radar development programs, refusing to share technical knowledge or coordinate procurement. Total Japanese radar production during the war reached approximately 300 units of all types, compared to American production exceeding 100,000 sets. The electronics industry that supported American radar development, manufacturing, cavity magnetrons, and sophisticated components by the tens of thousands simply didn't exist in Japan. Critical materials, rare earth elements, and specialized alloys were unavailable to Japanese industry operating under blockade that grew tighter as American submarines systematically destroyed merchant shipping. The doctrinal paralysis that gripped Japanese naval command after Vella Gulf reflected deeper institutional problems that no amount of warrior spirit could overcome. Japanese naval education emphasized historical precedent, studying victories at Tsushima and earlier engagements where Japanese forces had triumphed through superior seamanship and aggressive tactics. The curriculum devoted enormous attention to torpedo tactics, night combat principles, and the spiritual foundations of martial excellence. What it lacked was systematic analysis of technological change, engineering education that might have equipped officers to understand radar's implications, or institutional flexibility that permitted rapid adaptation when foundational assumptions proved false. American naval education, particularly at the Naval War College, emphasized scenario-based problem-solving, wargaming that tested doctrine against unexpected situations, and technological integration that assumed continuous advancement in weapons and sensors. American officers studied Plan Orange extensively, the pre-war strategy for Pacific conflict that assumed methodical advance across the ocean, culminating in decisive battle near the Philippines. When actual war diverged from peacetime assumptions, American doctrine evolved rapidly, incorporating lessons from defeats, adapting tactics to exploit technological advantages, accepting that spiritual conviction couldn't substitute for effective weapons and sound tactics. The Battle of Cape Street, George, on November 25, 1943, demonstrated that Vella Gulf wasn't lucky accident, but rather herald of systematic American superiority. Captain Arleigh Burke, commanding Destroyer Squadron 23, intercepted 5 Japanese destroyers conducting another supply run. Burke's Little Beavers, so nicknamed for their aggressive tactics and youth, had trained intensively in radar-directed night combat. When radar detected the Japanese force at 35,000 yards, Burke's destroyers tracked the enemy for 40 minutes, maneuvering into optimal attack position while Japanese lookouts saw nothing. At 0141 hours, Burke's squadron attacked, destroyers Dunlap, Maury, and Craven, launching torpedoes in coordinated spread, while Burke's division provided gunfire support. The entire engagement was conducted by radar plot. Visual contact with enemy forces was never achieved nor required, Burke's after-action report noted with clinical precision. 3 Japanese destroyers, Onami, Makinami, and Yugiri, were sunk with 647 Japanese killed. American losses totaled 0 casualties, 0 damage. Not a single Japanese torpedo or shell struck American ships. Burke's destroyers had achieved perfect tactical execution through electronics and training, rendering Japanese visual superiority and warrior spirit completely irrelevant. Japanese naval leadership, confronting two decisive defeats in night destroyer actions separated by less than 4 months, concluded that night surface combat was no longer viable against radar-equipped American forces. Orders from Combined Fleet Headquarters essentially abandoned night destroyer offensive actions, acknowledging reality that decades of training and tactical development had been rendered obsolete by technology Japan couldn't match. The Tokyo Express supply runs that had sustained isolated garrisons ceased. Japanese destroyers, once the terror of night combat, were relegated to defensive screens around carrier task forces, convoy escort duties, and increasingly desperate evacuation missions that suffered catastrophic losses. The attrition among Japanese destroyer forces accelerated dramatically through late 1943 and 1944. American air superiority made daylight operations suicidal. American radar made night operations equally deadly, but for different reasons. Japanese destroyers attempting supply missions found themselves caught between aerial attack during day and radar-directed torpedo attacks at night. The destroyer force that had numbered 70 modern ships at Pearl Harbor diminished steadily, losses mounting faster than Japanese shipyards could replace them. By mid-1944, Japan had lost over half its destroyer strength, with surviving ships increasingly relegated to training duties or pierside immobility due to fuel shortages caused by American submarine attacks on tankers. The psychological impact of technological obsolescence proved as damaging as material losses. Young Japanese officers who had trained for years in night combat skills watched their expertise become worthless. Lookouts selected for superior vision found themselves blind compared to American radar. Torpedo officers who had mastered long-lance employment discovered their weapons couldn't compensate for inability to locate targets or avoid American attacks. The spiritual foundation of Japanese naval training, the emphasis on warrior virtue and aggressive spirit, couldn't address fundamental reality that wars are won by nations that can produce superior weapons in greater quantity and employ them effectively. The Battle of Empress Augusta Bay on November 2, 1943, illustrated the complete reversal of tactical advantage. Rear Admiral Sentaro Omori, commanding a Japanese force that included 2 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 6 destroyers, intercepted an American task force protecting landings on Bougainville. Omori possessed superior numbers and firepower, his force including ships that had performed brilliantly in earlier night actions. At 0227 hours, American radar detected the Japanese force at 35,900 yards, range beyond which Japanese lookouts could see anything. For the next 2 hours, American ships tracked Japanese movements with perfect clarity, while Omori operated blind, maneuvering based on visual sightings that came too late for effective response. American destroyers launched coordinated torpedo attacks from ranges and angles Japanese commanders couldn't anticipate. When Japanese ships finally located American forces and opened fire, their targets had already maneuvered away based on radar warning, leaving Japanese shells impacting empty water. The battle ended with Japanese losses, including light cruiser Sendai and destroyer Hagikaze, while American damage was minimal. Samuel Eliot Morrison, official historian of U.S. naval operations, concluded that Empress Augusta Bay marked the end of Japan's previous advantage in night engagement. The final demonstration of American destroyer torpedo dominance came at the Battle of Surigao Strait on October 25, 1944, the last surface engagement where battleships would exchange fire and simultaneously the ultimate vindication of destroyer torpedo tactics. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura commanded a Japanese force attempting to enter Vella Gulf through Surigao Strait, a narrow waterway where geography constrained maneuver and American forces waited in carefully prepared ambush. Nishimura's force included 2 battleships, Fuso and Yamashiro, heavy cruiser Mogami, and 4 destroyers, powerful warships that in daylight gun battle might have inflicted terrible damage. Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf commanded American forces positioned to defend the strait, an overwhelming force including 6 battleships, 5 of which had been sunk or damaged at Pearl Harbor and subsequently repaired, 8 cruisers, and 28 destroyers, supported by 39 PT boats. The battleships, positioned across the northern exit of the strait, would theoretically deliver crushing gunfire once Japanese forces came within range. But Oldendorf understood that destroyers armed with torpedoes and radar could inflict devastating damage before battleships ever engaged, and he positioned destroyer squadrons along both flanks of the strait to launch coordinated attacks as Japanese forces advanced north. At 2300 hours on October 24th, PT boats made first contact with Nishimura's force as it entered the southern approaches to Surigao Strait. The PT boats attacked aggressively, firing over 30 torpedoes in confused night actions, where Japanese destroyers responded with gunfire and searchlights. The PT attacks achieved no hits, but served to alert Nishimura that American forces were present and active, forcing the Japanese commander to increase speed and tighten formation, reducing his ability to maneuver when more dangerous threats materialized. Captain Jesse Coward's Destroyer Squadron 54, 5 destroyers positioned along the strait's eastern flank, made radar contact at 0240 hours on October 25th. The destroyers, Reme, McGowan, Melvin, McDermott, and Monson, tracked the Japanese force with precision, maneuvering into optimal firing positions while Nishimura's lookouts strained unsuccessfully into darkness. At 0300 hours, Coward's Eastern Group launched 27 torpedoes in carefully calculated spreads, designed to bracket the Japanese formation regardless of evasive action. His Western Group simultaneously fired 20 torpedoes from the opposite flank, creating crossing torpedo tracks that turned the strait into killing ground. Multiple torpedoes struck Japanese ships almost simultaneously. Battleship Fuso took one or more hits that broke her keel, the massive ship splitting in 2 sections that would burn for hours before sinking. Destroyers Michisho, Asagumo, and Yamagumo were all struck, the explosions catastrophic against thin destroyer hulls. Michisho sank almost immediately, only 4 crew members surviving from her entire complement. Asagumo's bow was blown completely off, the destroyer left drifting and helpless. Yamagumo suffered hits that detonated her magazines, the destroyer exploding and sinking within minutes. Commander Robert Phillips aboard McDermott achieved the most successful torpedo spread launched by any American destroyer in the war, 3 hits from a single salvo that destroyed 3 different Japanese ships. His spread, fired with intermediate speed setting and shallow depth, achieved perfect geometry, torpedoes arriving simultaneously at different points along the Japanese column. The precision wasn't luck, but rather product of radar fire control, analog computer calculations, and crew training that had transformed torpedo attack from art dependent on visual estimation to science based on electronic measurement. Captain Roland Smoot's Destroyer Squadron 24 attacked next, 3 destroyers from each flank launching 29 torpedoes total. Battleship Yamashiro, Nishimura's flagship, took at least 1 torpedo hit that reduced her speed and started flooding in multiple compartments. More Japanese destroyers were struck, some sinking immediately, others left burning and dead in the water. In less than 40 minutes, American destroyers had fired over 70 torpedoes, achieving hit rates that exceeded 30%, an extraordinary accuracy for weapons that Japanese intelligence had dismissed as inferior. Admiral Nishimura, on Yamashiro's flag bridge, attempted to comprehend the disaster unfolding around him. His force had been ambushed in darkness by enemies he couldn't see, struck by torpedoes fired from ranges and angles he couldn't predict. His destroyers destroyed or disabled before they could effectively respond. At 0330 hours, he radioed combined fleet headquarters, enemy torpedo boats and destroyers on both sides of northern entrance to Surigao Strait. 2 of our destroyers torpedoed and drifting, Yamashiro hit by 1 torpedo but fit for battle. The message understated catastrophic losses, perhaps because Nishimura couldn't yet grasp the full scope of destruction, or perhaps because warrior culture demanded optimistic reporting even in extremis. Yamashiro continued north, accompanied only by heavy cruiser Mogami and destroyer Shigure, the sole survivor from Nishimura's original destroyer screen. At 0351 hours, they came within range of Oldendorf's battleships positioned across the northern exit. What followed was crossing the T, the classic naval maneuver where one battle line sails perpendicular to an advancing enemy formation, bringing all guns to bear, while the enemy can only reply with forward turrets. For 18 minutes, 6 American battleships, 8 cruisers, and multiple destroyers poured shells into the crippled Japanese force. West Virginia, equipped with the latest fire control radar, opened fire at 22,800 yards, extreme range where Japanese optical directors couldn't effectively return fire. Yamashiro absorbed dozens of shell hits, her superstructure wrecked, her guns destroyed, fires raging uncontrolled throughout the ship. At 0405 hours, destroyer Benion's Torpedo struck the battleship's stern, the final blow that caused catastrophic flooding. Yamashiro rolled over and sank at approximately 0420 hours, taking Admiral Nishimura and most of her crew with her. Over 1,300 Japanese sailors died aboard the battleship, drowning in compartments that flooded in seconds or burning in fires fed by ruptured fuel lines. Mogami and Shigure attempted to withdraw south through the strait, running gauntlet of American destroyers that had repositioned for pursuit. Mogami suffered additional damage from destroyer gunfire and air attacks the following morning, eventually being scuttled by Japanese destroyer Akebono after the crew abandoned ship. Shigure, veteran survivor of Vella Gulf, again escaped destruction through combination of maneuverability and fortune, the destroyer's survival becoming almost supernatural in Japanese accounts that struggled to explain how one ship could repeatedly survive battles that destroyed entire squadrons. The Battle of Surigao Strait cost Japan 2 battleships, 3 destroyers, and over 4,000 sailors killed. American losses totaled 39 killed and 114 wounded, with minor damage to several destroyers and the loss of 1 PT boat. The disparity was so complete that it defied traditional understanding of naval combat. Japanese forces, advancing with powerful warships and experienced crews, had been systematically destroyed by enemies they never effectively engaged, victims of technology that negated every traditional advantage and tactics specifically designed to exploit that technological superiority. Admiral Thomas Kincaid, commanding 7th Fleet, later wrote that the destroyer torpedo attacks in Surigao Strait were brilliantly conceived and well executed, understated praise for actions that had revolutionized destroyer employment. The coordinated flanking attacks, multiple squadrons launching from opposite sides to create crossing torpedo tracks, radar-directed firing that achieved accuracy impossible through visual methods, all demonstrated tactical sophistication that Japanese forces couldn't match, and that American forces had developed through systematic analysis of earlier failures. The broader strategic context of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history, included simultaneous American victories in other actions. The Battle off Samar on October 25 saw destroyer escorts and destroyers from Taffy 3 execute desperate torpedo attacks against Admiral Kurita's center force, sacrificing themselves to protect vulnerable escort carriers. The battles off Cape Engano saw American carrier aircraft destroy remaining Japanese fleet carriers. Across 4 days of combat involving over 360 ships and 200,000 sailors, Japanese naval power was broken beyond recovery. But it was the destroyer actions at Surigao Strait that most completely demonstrated how technology and tactics had reversed the balance of naval warfare. The statistics of destroyer combat tell the story of technological revolution with brutal clarity. Pre-radar era, December 1941 through October 1942, Japanese destroyer losses in night combat totaled 8 ships, American losses 11, exchange ratio favoring Japan. Early radar era, November 1942 through June 1943, Japanese losses 19, American losses 7, exchange ratio 2.7 to 1 favoring America. Mature radar era, July 1943 through August 1945, Japanese destroyer losses 47, American losses 4, exchange ratio 11.8 to 1 favoring America. The transformation exceeded anything Japanese naval planners had anticipated possible. In 20 months, American forces had reversed 2 decades of Japanese tactical superiority, converting destroyer combat from arena, where Japanese training and weapons provided decisive advantage, to killing ground, where American technology achieved dominance so complete that Japanese forces couldn't achieve even favorable exchange ratios. The Fletcher-class destroyers and their radar systems had accomplished what Japanese intelligence insisted was impossible, rendering Japanese destroyer doctrine obsolete while establishing new tactical paradigms that would define naval warfare for decades. The human cost of this transformation defied simple calculation. Japanese destroyer crews, trained for years in tactics that emphasized close-range torpedo attacks and aggressive night fighting, found themselves unable to employ their skills against enemies they couldn't locate, couldn't track, couldn't engage effectively. The frustration of dying without opportunity to fight according to training. The psychological devastation of watching technological superiority negate warrior virtue contributed to deteriorating morale that Japanese leadership addressed through increasingly desperate measures, including kamikaze attacks that sacrificed pilots' lives for minimal tactical effect. American destroyer crews, by contrast, experienced vindication after 18 months of fighting at disadvantage. The early war disasters, battles where Japanese forces had destroyed American ships while suffering minimal losses, had bred doubts about weapons, tactics, and leadership. Vella Gulf and subsequent victories demonstrated that American industry could produce weapons that worked, that American tactical doctrine could evolve to exploit technological advantages, that American crews, when properly equipped and trained, could defeat enemies who had seemed invincible. The morale impact of this transformation rippled through the entire Pacific Fleet, reinforcing confidence that technological superiority backed by industrial production would guarantee ultimate victory. The Fletcher-class destroyers themselves became symbols of American naval power, 175 ships built across 11 different shipyards in massive production effort that Japanese industry couldn't remotely match. Each ship represented approximately 50,000 man-hours of labor, millions of dollars of materials, sophisticated equipment that required electronics industry infrastructure Japan didn't possess. The destroyers served not just in Pacific, but also in Atlantic, Mediterranean, and every theater where American forces operated. Their reliability, firepower, and technological sophistication established standards that influenced destroyer design worldwide for decades after the war. Post-war analysis by Japanese naval officers, interviewed extensively by American intelligence, revealed consistent acknowledgement that radar had fundamentally transformed naval warfare beyond Japanese ability to adapt. Officers testified that by mid-1943, Japanese command understood the radar gap, but suppressed this knowledge to maintain crew morale. The belief that American technology couldn't compensate for Japanese warrior spirit, that spiritual superiority would ultimately prevail over material advantage, proved fatal delusion that cost thousands of lives and dozens of ships. Captain Tamechi Hara, whose survival through 16 major battles aboard Sugiura provided unique perspective on the war's progression, later wrote that Japanese leadership's failure was refusing to acknowledge that technology had made traditional tactics obsolete. His memoir, Japanese Destroyer Captain, published in 1961, remains one of few first-hand Japanese accounts that honestly assessed how completely American radar and torpedoes had reversed the tactical balance. Hara criticized Japanese command for continuing to employ destroyer tactics that assumed visual superiority and long-lance advantage, even after evidence proved those assumptions false. The torpedo that hit Sugiura at Vella Gulf, the dud that passed through her rudder without detonating, represented both American imperfection and Japanese fortune. Had that torpedo functioned as designed, Hara wouldn't have survived to provide his account, and one more data point would have been added to statistics demonstrating American torpedo effectiveness. That it was a dud, one of the small percentage of weapons that still malfunctioned despite fixes implemented through 1943, illustrates that American technology wasn't perfect but rather good enough. Perfect reliability isn't necessary for decisive victory. Sufficient reliability combined with numerical superiority and sound tactics achieves the same result. The Mark 15 torpedo, once objects of derision among American submarine and destroyer crews who watched perfect attacks fail due to depth control problems, magnetic exploder malfunctions, and contact exploder failures, ultimately became weapons that destroyed Japanese naval power. The transformation from catastrophic unreliability to decisive effectiveness took 21 months of bureaucratic warfare between submarine commanders and Bureau of Ordnance, systematic testing that identified specific defects, and engineering solutions that corrected fundamental design flaws. By September 1943, when modified torpedoes began reaching fleet destroyers in substantial numbers, American weapons finally functioned as originally intended. The irony that Japanese intelligence had observed American torpedo failures in early war period and concluded that American weapons were permanently inferior represents classic intelligence failure, mistaking temporary technical problems for fundamental inadequacy. Japanese assessments, based on accurate observation of submarine failures and early destroyer combat, didn't account for American industrial capacity to identify problems and implement solutions at scale. Japanese culture of institutional face-saving and resistance to acknowledging errors meant similar problems in Japanese weapons and tactics were often ignored rather than addressed, creating asymmetry in adaptive capacity that proved decisive. The Battle of Surigao Strait marked not just tactical victory, but symbolic culmination of broader transformation in Pacific naval warfare, the battleship duel that Japanese planning had anticipated for decades. The decisive battle where battle lines would exchange gunfire in climactic engagement occurred exactly once, lasted less than 20 minutes, and was thoroughly one-sided because American destroyers had already crippled Japanese forces before battleships engaged. The vision of warfare that had shaped Japanese naval doctrine since Tsushima, where disciplined formations exchanged fire at range until one side's morale or material broke, had become obsolete, replaced by three-dimensional warfare, where submarines, aircraft, and radar-equipped surface forces operated in coordinated campaigns that Japanese doctrine hadn't anticipated. Admiral Kurita's center force, which had withdrawn from Leyte Gulf after the Battle off Samar despite having vulnerable American carriers nearly within grasp, later received criticism from Japanese officers who believed aggressive attack, regardless of odds, represented proper warrior spirit. What these critics failed to understand, what Japanese doctrine never fully incorporated, was that American technological superiority meant traditional calculations of combat power no longer applied. Kurita's heavy ships, even achieving surprise against escort carriers, would have faced coordinated attacks from aircraft, destroyers with radar-directed weapons, and submarines positioned to intercept any withdrawal. The tactical advantage that Japanese forces might have achieved through aggressive attack would have been negated by American ability to concentrate overwhelming force guided by technology that Japanese forces couldn't match. The fundamental lesson, one that Japanese leadership never fully accepted even in defeat, was that modern warfare rewards nations that can produce superior weapons in quantity and employ them effectively through doctrine that adapts to technological change. Warrior spirit, aggressive tactics, superior training, all these factors matter, but cannot compensate for decisive technological inferiority backed by industrial production capacity that exceeds enemy capability by orders of magnitude. Japan entered war with United States, believing that spiritual superiority and tactical excellence would offset American material advantages. 4 years later, Japanese industry lay in ruins, merchant marine destroyed, navy shattered, the homeland blockaded and bombed, population facing starvation, all because technology and production proved more decisive than spirit and training. The American destroyer force that accomplished this transformation numbered hundreds of ships by war's end, Fletchers joined by Allen M. Sumner, and Gearing-class destroyers that further improved on the Fletcher design. These ships served not just through World War II but through Korean War, Vietnam War, and beyond. Many transferred to Allied navies where they remained in service into the 1980s and 90s. The last Fletcher-class destroyer, Bam Quitlahuac, formerly USS John Rogers, served in Mexican Navy until 2001, extraordinary service life of almost 60 years that testified to soundness of original design. The radar systems that revolutionized destroyer combat evolved through continuous improvement. SG radar succeeded by more sophisticated models that provided better discrimination, longer range, automatic tracking. The plan position indicator displays that gave American operators intuitive understanding of battlespace became standard across all nations' navies, the fundamental interface through which naval combat would be conducted for remainder of 20th century and beyond. The MIT radiation laboratory that developed the SG radar employed nearly 4,000 scientists and engineers at peak investment of intellectual capital that Japan couldn't match, and that represented American commitment to technological warfare that Japanese leadership had fatally underestimated. The Japanese destroyer captains who survived the war, men like Hara who had commanded through multiple battles and witnessed transformation from Japanese superiority to American dominance, provided invaluable perspective on how quickly technological change can render traditional doctrine obsolete. Their accounts, written after years of reflection, acknowledge that Japanese training and tactics were sound for the warfare they anticipated, but completely inadequate for the technological conflict they actually faced. The lesson extends beyond World War II naval combat to broader questions about military adaptation, institutional flexibility, and willingness to acknowledge when foundational assumptions prove false. The mathematical certainty that governed destroyer combat by late 1944, the 11-to-1 exchange ratio favoring American forces, represented not just technological superiority but systemic advantage in every aspect of warfare. American destroyers had better sensors, better weapons, better fire control, better training on relevant systems, better maintenance support, better industrial backing that ensured broken equipment could be repaired or replaced, better tactical doctrine that exploited technological advantages while minimizing weaknesses. Japanese destroyers, even when well-maintained and aggressively commanded, operated at cumulative disadvantage that no amount of warrior spirit could overcome. The Fletcher-class destroyers' 10 torpedo tubes, quintuple mounts, positioned amidships where they could train to either beam, represented industrial warfare's answer to tactical requirements. The ability to launch 10 torpedoes in rapid succession, creating spread that saturated target area, provided volume of fire that guaranteed hits against formations that might evade smaller salvos. Japanese destroyers, typically mounting 9 torpedoes in triple mounts with reload capability, theoretically could achieve similar or greater volume, but rarely found circumstances in actual combat that permitted time for manual reloading under fire. The American approach, accepting limitation of no combat reload in exchange for immediate volume of fire, reflected tactical philosophy, emphasizing decisive initial attack over sustained engagement. The Battle of Vella Gulf, where 24 torpedoes fired in 63 seconds destroyed 3 destroyers and changed course of naval warfare, deserves recognition as pivotal moment comparable to better-known carrier battles. While Midway, Philippine Sea, and other carrier engagements receive greater historical attention, it was surface actions like Vella Gulf, Cape Street George, and Surigao Strait that demonstrated how thoroughly technology had transformed naval combat at fundamental level. Carrier warfare was obviously important, representing new dimension of naval power, but destroyer combat in darkness revealed starkest contrast between sides, most complete reversal of tactical advantage, clearest demonstration that technology trumps tradition when differential becomes sufficient. The Japanese captains, who never expected American destroyers to fire 20 torpedoes in 4 minutes, who assumed that American forces lacked training and weapons for effective night combat, paid for these assumptions with their lives and their ships. Commander Sugiura aboard Hagikaze, Admiral Nishimura aboard Yamashiro, hundreds of destroyer captains and thousands of sailors who perished in night actions from Vella Gulf through Surigao Strait, all died because Japanese doctrine failed to anticipate American technological revolution and tactical adaptation. Their deaths weren't meaningless sacrifice in service of worthy cause, but rather testament to institutional failure to acknowledge reality when evidence contradicted comfortable assumptions. The American victory in destroyer combat, achieved through combination of technological superiority and tactical evolution, provided template for subsequent naval development. The radar-directed torpedo attacks pioneered by Moosbrugger at Vella Gulf, refined by Burke at Cape Street, George, perfected at Surigao Strait, established principles that would govern surface combat for decades. The integration of sensors, weapons, and fire control into unified system that allowed engagement beyond visual range became fundamental requirement for modern naval forces. The emphasis on crew training focused on electronics and fire control rather than purely traditional seamanship, represented cultural shift that Japanese Navy never successfully implemented, but that American Navy embraced as essential for technological warfare. The night that had been Japan's greatest ally became, through radar and coordinated torpedo tactics, the environment where American forces achieved most complete dominance. The darkness that Japanese destroyers had dominated for 20 months became killing ground, where Japanese ships died without seeing their killers, where Japanese tactics perfected through years of training proved worthless against technology they couldn't match. The transformation was complete, irreversible, and devastating, changing naval warfare fundamentally, while demonstrating that in modern conflict, those who see first win, those who see farthest dominate, and those who remain blind to technological change are condemned to defeat in darkness they once ruled. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.